You've heard the conventional view. Now prepare yourself to hear the other side. High school teachers Mike Margison and Justin Spears bring you the alternative view you didn't get in the classroom. Now here they are, Margison and Spears.
Well, good Saturday morning to you all out there. Hopefully you're all doing well this fine Saturday morning. It's a gloomy Saturday morning here in central Indiana. We have some epic flooding going on here in our state, up to the north and down to the south, the Ohio River, and up north there in South Bend. I think this made national news that there's been mass evacuations up there. So we've just been mired in some rain, but it's starting to warm up, so that's a positive sign. So hopefully that will continue to be the trend here, and I can live with the rain as long as we get the warmth coming in. So yeah, we're settled in here on a Saturday morning. You know, there's been a lot going on this week. I know I feel like I've put a lot of content out there, and that's a good thing. I think, you know, from our perspective, you know, some of it hasn't always been the most positive messaging, unfortunately, but you know, it's definitely an important topic and something that is timely. And as I've said in all of the different episodes that I've been on lately and appearances that we've had, that, you know, I continue to say we are certainly not pushing a narrative of what to think, but just encouraging people to think. Obviously, when tragedies like what happened down in Florida here, gosh, it's been over a week ago now, I think it has happened. It's an important aspect of the thinking process of taking it all in, to have a platform to share what's going on, you know, for you to be able to express how you feel about something. And it's also important for you to become educated and think about all of the different perspectives, because you see a certain narrative that's pushed, or you hear a certain narrative that's pushed, and you can quickly become ossified by that. And so hopefully, you know, we are presenting some counter messaging to what you're going to hear in the mainstream media. And so that leads us to why we're here this morning. And I am thrilled to be joined this morning by one of our Cerberus Radio Network hosts, Suzanne Sherman. Suzanne's been on with us here on the other side before. And so she has been kind enough to get up on a Saturday morning and join us to talk about gun safety and school safety, and, you know, the whole notion here of what appears to be the message coming out of the White House, that there would be a desire to arm teachers, and what are the implications of that? Is this a good thing? So that's going to be what we're tackling this morning. So I want to go ahead and welcome in this morning Suzanne Sherman. Suzanne, how are you?
I am doing well. It's nice to be here. Thanks for having me with you.
Yeah, you bet. You bet. And for our listeners too, just wanted to let you know that was working with Mike on this. He was tied up a little bit this morning around the house, and just couldn't cut out the time to make it in today. But he and I did talk to one another this morning briefly. We exchanged some messages, and he's got some things that he wanted me to work in, and I'll make sure that I do that as well. So, Suzanne, I kind of wanted to start off the show this morning before we jump into talking a little bit about this idea that President Trump has put forward here about potentially arming teachers in the classroom and paying bonuses and things of that nature, to just talk a little bit about this idea of school safety. You know, whenever something like this, like a Sandy Hook, a Columbine happens, it clearly gets people very, very emotional, because many people can relate, right? I mean, those who are parents, who have children, who are workers in the public school system, grandparents, what have you, you know, there's that connection that's made there. And then, you know, so you're already on a heightened, you know, state of emotion about that. But then when you start to analyze, well, what does it look like in our school system and stuff, it's important to put things into perspective. So let's talk for just a moment here about that. I did a little bit of research prior to jumping on here and looked at some statistics related to public schools and these incidents. As of 2013, 2014, there were about 98,000 public schools that were operating in the United States. And I'm sure that number has inched up a little bit more, probably not dramatically here over the last 5 years or so. And I also read a U.S. USA Today article that chronicled a series, or an episode done by Shep Smith on Fox News, where he chronicled 25 school shootings since Columbine in 1999. Now, when we put that into perspective, that's not a high percentage. And I know one incident is too much, right? But certainly, is this worthy of having a national discussion where we're talking about some of the actions that are on the table?
Well, I think if we look at this objectively, what is the media's end goal? The media is overwhelmingly anti-firearms. They do not want us having guns, and they jump on this every time we have a situation in a school to ban firearms. And they tried this a long time ago with the handgun. And after the Heller decision, where Scalia said that the handgun was protected by the Second Amendment, that's a topic for another show, that the attempted ban on handguns failed. So what did they have to turn to next? They had to turn to the scary militarized weapons. They want these guns gone, but they're ignoring the other issues so they can go to the ultimate goal, which is getting us disarmed. And the narrative when they have an event like this, it's either ban firearms on the one side or have more double down and have guns on the school campuses. And this is tragic because, you know, we all assume that when we send our kids to school that they're going to a safe place. I lived in a neighborhood school when we lived in San Francisco. I walked to school, and until they implemented school busing by force, it was a very safe place to be. We don't want to think that we have to send our children places with now they're having bulletproof backpacks on. So what's the real discussion we should be having here?
Yeah, that's a great point. And again, I always like to look at this too from a perspective of society at large. And again, doing a little bit more research here, you know, certainly we are going to focus in on school safety and guns in that regard. But, you know, just think about, and I think what this will do is kind of hopefully encourage the listener to think a little bit about this from a more holistic approach. When we look at just violence in general in our society, it is obviously clearly violent crime. I know people talk about, is it up, is it down, and things of that nature. But I went back and looked at Chicago, and I know Chicago gets picked on a lot. But going back to last year, 2017, there were over 650 homicides. And I did the math there on that. And there might be a reason why I teach social studies, by the way. But I think I got this right here when I did this. Divided that out by 52, and it came out to be 13 people per week were killed in just the city of Chicago alone in 2017, and it was 15 a week per week the year before that. So I find that fascinating that we will take an instance, and I know that there's different emotion involved when you're talking about kids and schools and things of that nature. But I think what this does is it dehumanizes, I guess. I don't know if that's the right word or not that I'm looking for here, but it certainly, to me, it's always kind of a head scratcher that we will look at this from this perspective, but we won't address the problem at large in our society.
Well, and it shows that we really don't care about the statistics, because statistically, Chicago is far more dangerous. So we have to look at how we think about Chicago. Well, these are all gangbangers, it's gang activity, and these are people that are unlawful regardless. So we really don't care about them. But if you care about the statistics, because people are saying, if we want to save just one more life, let's look at the life and the frustration of the people in Chicago. I was there a couple of years ago and had an opportunity to speak to a few cab drivers who were very frustrated with their government, because they said all they care about in Chicago is perpetuating or furthering this desire to disarm people, but they're not addressing the issue of violence and helping the people in the Black community. Progressivism is the goal that trumps everything else, from social justice to gun violence, whatever you want. The progressive juggernaut must keep moving forward.
Yeah, that's right. Because, you know, the other angle to this that I always hear talked about is when people would look at progressive ideas and ideology, and which usually obviously comes out of the Democrat Party here in this country, and how tough on guns and violence and stuff. But yet, when you look at, for example, President Obama's administration and the drone bombs, and it's justifiable to be able to kill certain people, or if you're doing it remotely, or something along those lines, and it's a little bit easier to stomach. But yeah, I think it just speaks overall to the heart of man, and how hardened our hearts are to people, and just this violence in general, whether it be in our public schools, or in our city, in community streets, or the violence that we export out to other countries. To me, nothing is more heartbreaking than looking at areas like Syria or Lebanon or Yemen, and seeing these poor innocent children that have been impacted by bombing raids and things of that nature, and to know that our country is complicit in that is it's hard to swallow as well. And this is something that Mike wanted me to address as well, when he and I were having our conversation, because you mentioned progressivism here too. And that is, with what people are calling for with bans on various weapons, and tougher, regulations on guns. It's clearly something that we've talked about before, but it's important to just reiterate here. You cannot legislate morality. You cannot take legislation in and of itself and see that as a cornerstone to solving these problems, because if that were the case, why do we have so many war-ons, right? The war on drugs, the war on crime, the war on poverty, all of the different pieces of legislation. Clearly, things like heroin are, through legislation illegal, yet we have a massive heroin problem in our communities today. So legislation in and of itself is certainly not going to be the solution.
And when you talk about all these different wars, who is the benefactor? Who benefits from all these wars? It's always government. Government gets broader, it takes more money from us, and the target of this war always gets worse. So what I have really come to the conclusion, and this is very depressing, is really what we have is a war on humanity, and the aggressor is the government. At what point are they going to say, we've bled enough out of our people, we're going to let them be? I don't think they're ever going to get to that point. So every opportunity, every school shooting, every tragedy like this turns out to be an opportunity for them to further this agenda. You did not hear for a ban on rifles after that nutcase wanted to shoot down Republican representatives in, I believe it was Maryland. You didn't hear that. They want Republicans killed. They don't care. So when we have the school, now we have these kids that are probably all ready to go, and they have now a massive organization coming on, a nationwide school walkout. Tell me there is not somebody behind this. And think about also the hypocrisy when those of us that were opposing the proposed Affordable Care Act, and we were saying, no, this is a bad idea, and trying to organize, the leftists were saying, no, this is a grassroots, or this is not grassroots, this is AstroTurf. If anything is a fake movement, it's this with the teenagers. And that kid that is the son of the FBI agent, what's his name, Hogg? I forgot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. And before we kind of move here a little bit more to talking a little bit about President Trump's proposal of putting guns into teachers' hands, let's talk for just a second here about the ramifications of what school has done here with this. I think, when we talk a little bit about the current state of education in our country today, certainly the school, through, obviously the way the government at the national level, and then even at the state and local level is set up, has some complicity in this. And I talked a little bit about this yesterday on K Talk on our appearance in the morning there. And I really think this needs to be more of a focal point of this discussion. And the fact that I think so many people will like to jump in to the middle of the conversation on, what happened here. Certainly we need to talk about security in the buildings and, whether or not we arm teachers or not. But I would like to have a conversation with people about the mental health and state of health of our kids in America today, and what factor does school play in that? And as a public education teacher, I've said quite a bit about this here recently. And again, I want to reemphasize with this: I am not attacking individual people in the community. Certainly, I am a part of that. Now, I will say, if you are in favor of what the current model is doing to our kids, then yes, I would call you out on that, because I think you're supporting and propping up a system that is, again, somewhat, if not wholly, complicit in causing these people to become our children to become mentally unstable. The pressures and stress of what school does in terms of standardized testing. Here in the state of Indiana, we have what is called an end of course assessment, an ECA, where you can sit through, for example, like an Algebra 1 class for 13 weeks, 26 weeks. And if you don't pass that ECA, you don't get the high school credit. Now, that's pretty high pressure. And when you put kids into that situation that may already have stress of just doing this on their own, and taking in the content, and now you tell them you got to pass this class or else, think about the psychological impact of what that says to them about their self-worth. People who have performance and anxiety issues. This is just placing a tremendous amount of pressure on our kids. And it's no wonder that they're wrecks, they're emotional wrecks. And when you factor in things like social media and the way that our interpersonal relationships has changed as a society, it's just a cocktail recipe for so many to become mentally unstable. Does that sound accurate?
When you mentioned the social media aspect of this too, when I was in school, school can be heartbreaking. We can have our issues, our embarrassments in school, but when I went, you get home and you just get away from it. Today with social media, it follows you everywhere. My neighbor's son, I should say somebody in my community, their son had a breakup with his girlfriend, and this girl and her boyfriend were texting him pictures of them kissing each other. And this kid was just out of his mind. So social media, I think, is playing a huge part in this. But even before this came about, I was home visiting my parents in Los Altos. This was years ago, and I was reading an article on the local paper that was talking about, I grew up in the Los Altos area, heart of Silicon Valley, about how these children in the schools, middle schools and high schools, are suffering. And part of this article says educators are seeing more and more students suffering from depression, anxiety, and social phobia. The acuity of mental illness among students has sharpened, and it's striking even younger children, though many quietly bear the stress. And now, this is from a high school student, said I was very good at putting up a facade. And this child went through a mental breakdown after getting all A's and 1 D. We have to look at what is going on in communities like this. And now this is spread to so many. But what I saw from where I grew up and where I also had my children in San Martin, California, and Santa Clara County, is you see parents trying to keep up in an area that is extremely expensive. You have both parents working. I didn't see many parents where they had the mom staying home. My mom stayed at home, and they are not raising their kids. My neighbors there, their babies went to daycare at 6 weeks old. And the mom even said, well, he's not going to get the attention he'll need, but at least he'll be safe. Well, why even have a child if you cannot raise them, if you cannot spend the time with them. These kids now, the schools are offering before and after school care. The parents are keeping up with expensive houses, expensive cars, boats, vacations. They're doing everything with spending time with their kids. And then when they are with them, you can see the parents watching at the riding lessons or taekwondo or whatever. They're all on their phones, texting their friends. They're not in the moment being with their kids. And the kids now also don't have the opportunity to just wander like I used to do. I'm significantly older than you. We used to just be able to wander around in the neighborhood. Now, if kids walk to the park by themselves, the police are called.
Yeah, that's an important component there as well. And yeah, that's so, gosh, it's hard to fathom. It's hard to think about the current state of parenting and relationships and the impact that our kids are crying out to us. They are asking us, they're begging for us to love them and show them the attention that they deserve as, children that are in our lives. And I was listening last night, actually, to a recent episode of the Tom Woods Show where he had a lady on who was kind of talking about libertarianism and parenting. And she brought up the exact same thing that you were just talking about, that, when we are with our kids, we think that, by sitting on the couch with our nose buried in our phones or on our laptop doing work or anything, that we're spending time with our kids, but we're not. We're just as disconnected as if we were at the office, physically detached from them. Emotionally detached is a problem as well. And so, yeah, to kind of bring it back then to the role of the school is, when we don't have that aspect of it, that variable of it at the home, and then on top of the pressure and stress that's placed on at school to fit in socially, to fit in academically, it's just a bad recipe. And I think really when we kind of talk back to what are some solutions and issues here related to what puts these kids into this mental state to want to go in and commit these atrocities, there's just a lack of support that comes out of our schools. And again, that's not to say that teachers don't care and aren't compassionate. I know a lot of people that are very compassionate and caring about students and would do whatever they needed to help them out, but it's got to be systemic. It can't be just one or two. I mentioned yesterday, too, that, our guidance counselors are woefully unprepared, and they will admit this. This is not a knock on them as people. They are great people that I think would just about run through a brick wall for their students, but they're not prepared with the skills that it takes to be able to help these kids cope with the everyday stresses, and to let them know that they have the platform to be able to do that. That's definitely an aspect of this that is not being addressed, that's not being talked about. But let's talk about what is being talked about, and that is, safety, security, and guns. If you heard what President Trump said here recently after he had his summit at the White House with some of the survivors of the shooting down in Florida, one of the things that I think he came out of from a messaging standpoint and saying was that, let's look at arming teachers in the classroom. And he laid out his plan of, whatever, if it would be 20% voluntary, maybe they would get bonuses. Obviously, they'd have to be trained. Let's talk for a second about the ramifications of that. Suzanne, I want to get your opinion on this first. Talk us through a little bit about the legality of doing something like this. It seems like there might be some maybe red flags here. What would be the impact of this from a legal perspective?
Well, going from the top down, from the legal perspective, first of all, this is nothing that President Trump has any business even discussing. But as we see, anytime we have an issue like this, we all look to our leader and for national solutions. This shooting, the Vegas shooting, the Orlando shooting, Sandy Hook, these are all local issues. They get national attention. We seek national solutions. What we should have is gathering in the communities and have them deciding for themselves what to do. So be that as it may, now do we want to turn our attention to having the teachers armed in the schools? I am neutral on that because there are some teachers that I would absolutely trust to be armed around my children. But you have to remember, teachers come from the community just like the law enforcement officers. So when they say trust the law enforcement to protect our children, we had 4 of them hiding behind their vehicles while the children were being slaughtered in this school. So teachers are fallible as well. And are they going to rise to the occasion? And again, they are members of society, as you mentioned on the show. Many of them are going through problems, divorces, they're on medication. So do we want to look at arming the teachers? Is that a possible solution? Or do we want to look at the bigger picture and see, is there a problem systemically with the school? So turning our attention to the teachers, you had some really good comments about some of the negatives on there. I also want to touch also, before we get to that, on the issue of bonuses. When you tie a bonus into a teacher being armed, you have to ask yourself, would somebody that would otherwise be uncomfortable with having a firearm go through the process and get one so they could get the extra money? And is that the kind of person that you want to trust with the firearm? I don't like the idea of a bonus, especially from a national perspective, federal tax dollars going through that. Again, if this is handled from a local level in a community, that's another thing.
Yeah, that's a really great point that you brought up there, that I think this isn't even being sniffed in the media.
No, it's not.
Let's talk for a second about who has authority and responsibility here. I've said before, and I'm open on the record with this, that if I had it my way, the national DOE would be abolished. It's an unconstitutional organization. It needs to be disbarred. All educational authority needs to be vested within the states. And even at that point, it needs to be the state DOEs need to serve just at the behest of local school districts that know best what their students need. The one-size-fits-all approach of education is proven to have failed. And so we need to give local school districts the opportunity to function and regulate themselves. They know, the people in the community know what the wants and needs of their students and children are better than anybody else. Why do we need bureaucrats that are hundreds of miles away, thousands of miles away, making decisions for local school districts? So I'm glad that you brought that up, because that is not even being discussed and talked about in any way, shape, or form through any outlet that I have read. Going to the point too about, trusting, I mentioned to you off air before we came on that, we live in a day and age where everybody has to have a hot take. Everybody has to come in with their flag planted firmly in the ground, ready to die on that hill. And it better be a polarizing, on one side of the aisle stance, or else you don't have a spine, you're weak, you're a flip-flopper. But the more I have kicked this around in my head, the more I go back and forth. I'm just like with you, what you said is where I see some teachers that I think, I would trust, I would feel 100% comfortable knowing that they had a firearm on their person and would not bat an eye about it. But then there are other people that I know who are in education. I mean, you don't even have to look very far. There's a viral video that's going around of a lady I think she's got like a squirt gun. Have you seen this video? And she's pointing it at her whiteboard, shooting at a picture of Donald Trump. Have you seen that video?
I have. And my first thought was, really, this is the kind of person that I want armed in the school? No, absolutely not. In fact, I had a comment where I said, I wouldn't even trust. A lot of people say we need to get corporal punishment back in the schools. Back in the day when I went, before electricity, I remember I had a teacher that would wash kids' mouths out with Physoderm if they cussed. And there was this one little kid, Ira, who was very, violent, had a very bad family situation. And it was sad I felt bad for him. And I remember her just taking a Q-tip and sticking it in his mouth. And this happened a few times. And one of the times he came back in, leaned against the door, wiped his mouth, and uttered the F word. Lesson was not learned. This kid just got angrier and angrier and angrier as the school got by. So I think now, particularly, how are these teachers going to be judging students that we know these teachers are hardcore leftists overwhelmingly? Statistics prove that. What if somebody comes to school with an American flag on their shirt? Well, we've been told in where I used to live, Ninth Circuit said these kids from Morgan Hill, they can't wear them because it's divisive. But what if they know something else about these kids' families? They're patriotic, they hunt or something like that. How is the teacher going to handle how they view? When I had this show with Dr. Marianne Block the other day, because we were talking about psychotropic drugs, she would get involved with the teachers and say, send me a note at the end of the week on how the child's behaving. She allowed the teacher to be under the impression that the child was being medicated. Once the teacher felt the child was being medicated or was under that impression, their opinion of the child changed, and that child's behavior was said to have improved. So we are having some people that are very subjective here, deciding how we are going to protect, how we are going to punish. I'll come right out and say it. These are government schools. I am opposed to all government schools unless we can break it down and have it at a community level. But again, we have Donald Trump, the president of the United States, who has absolutely no authority to comment on this stuff or have any kind of regulations or suggest regulations, coming up with national solutions. More national solutions from an unconstitutional agency, the Department of Education, is not going to be the answer. These kids are suffering. When my kids were even in a private school, and this is a little off topic, but we have to look at how males are affected in the school system. It is very difficult for them to sit still, and they're getting less and less exercise. My son, I pulled him out of second grade. He used to scream in his sleep. I had many homeschooling parents who said their children, their boys, had nightmares, and they all stopped once they pulled him out of the school system. I absolutely do not think that institutional forms of education are good for our boys, our male children, and we need to look at that because they are suffering, and medication cannot hide it. And we keep running to the boogeyman of the day, the AR-15.
That is a great point, and I want to pick that up here in just a moment. But for those who are listening on 92.1, 1550 AM or on WCVLAM.com, we are going to have to end the program here today. For the radio audience, I want to thank you all for tuning in today, as you have each and every week. Thank you for the support. Remember, if you hear anything on this show that is of interest to you and you'd like to comment or continue the conversation, you can find us on our YouTube page. You can find us on social media. It's Mike and Justin on YouTube, The Other Side Podcast. You can find us on Facebook at TOS_podcast, or you can find us on Twitter at TOS Podcast, all one word. So thank you for tuning in today. Be sure to join us back here again next week at 8 a.m. For our audience here on YouTube, we will continue the discussion on the other side. Okay, welcome back. Before we left our radio audience, Suzanne brought up a great point here where she was talking a little bit about the issue of medication, and that definitely seems to be the point of emphasis here that we've gone to with how to cope with this. And I know I have shared my story here over with my oldest son in the first couple of years that he has been in school. He's currently a fourth grader, and 2 of the first 3 years that he has been in public school, his teachers have recommended at some point that he be tested for ADHD, and we've refused to do it for a number of reasons. Number one, as you were talking about, Suzanne, I do not want my son placed on psychotropic drugs. I don't want him on Adderall. I don't want him on any kind of medication that may have long-term effects or consequences. The other thing that doesn't get talked about in this equation as well is, and I don't know if you had any working with this in your time of having your kids in school, is that this oftentimes comes with the tag of an IEP, an individualized education plan. And that is something that stays with the student their entire educational life. And that can bring about a stigma. It is abused. The IEP is abused by people in public education. What I mean by that is we, especially at the high school level where kids have been on this IEP and they get accommodations, they get extra time, they get extended time on testing, they get the use of supplements and things of that nature. They can have their test read aloud, they can use calculators and things of that nature. In some ways, there are kids that need those things, but I have seen a tremendous amount of kids that game the system. The parents abuse the system, and that does nothing to benefit the child as they move toward, graduating and moving on in their adult life as well. So there's that aspect to it as well. But you had your episode with Dr. Block on, and I just absolutely loved what she had to say. Let's talk for a second here. When we're kind of addressing the whole idea of what is leading kids down this path of mental instability. And earlier in the episode here, we talked a little bit about the role of parenting. Talk about just something as simple as nutrition as a fix to this, as opposed to running to medication.
Well, this is something that we addressed on the show, and I would encourage listeners to purchase a book, No More ADHD by Dr. Marianne Block. And it essentially says, she comes up with the conclusion that ADHD is an entirely made-up disorder. It is based on a diagnosis premised on subjective analysis and opinions by the parents and the teachers. Based on that, absent any form of medical testing whatsoever. And I'm speaking from experience. They tried this with my younger son. They want to put these kids on highly addictive, highly dangerous psychotropic medications, and then they will add on others to alleviate the symptoms, the side effects that are caused by this. So first of all, ADHD can be addressed by looking at the underlying causes. Now, the other thing you have to think of, these schools get money for every kid that is diagnosed with a learning disability, that needs extra care, that is on an IEP. That translates to more funding for them. So tie this now also, and then I will get to the nutrition because I wrote all these notes down furiously. The school records, and with the proposed enhanced background checks. Medical records are now required to be kept electronically. So we have the ACA, we have education, and we have now enhanced background checks. What is going on here is a far more nefarious plan to disarm future generations. So they're going to indoctrinate these kids in the school system, and they're going to ultimately disarm them by looking at ADHD or any of these other issues and saying, clearly, we can't let these people ever be trusted with firearms. Now, going to nutrition, this ties in with the busy parent syndrome. I remember one mom, when we were talking about feeding our kids breakfast, I had actually made my son really nice hot breakfast before I sent him off to school. And she just laughed. She goes, oh my gosh, I just throw some cold cereal on the table. Well, what is cold cereal? First of all, it's not food. It is processed sugar, carbohydrates, and absolute garbage, preservatives. And it gets into these kids' bodies. And after about an hour and a half after they eat this, the adrenal system has to kick in to make up for the sugar crash. And what happens is what Dr. Block called the fight or flight syndrome. And you try and get especially a young male to sit still, and having some problems caused now by nutrition. Because I said, look, little Johnny has a bowl of Captain Crunch before cereal. What can happen after this? Well, he misbehaves as his body can't help but do. And then he gets into trouble and he will be labeled. And this could go with him, as you said, for the rest of his life. So they're not looking at what the proper nutrition for these kids should be. Cereal is way easier for a busy parent who's also trying to get to work than it is making a hot breakfast. What she suggested is these kids have access to small amounts of protein throughout the day so they don't get this. We also see kids, again, getting less and less time to have recess, to run around. My friend's 7-year-old son got stuck having to sit out recess because he had to go to the bathroom during class. So what he needed to make him settle in and behave better, he was denied as punishment.
Yeah, I know my oldest son has had several instances, as a matter of fact, even over these last couple of weeks, where he has told me that he's had to stay inside from recess to finish up work that he didn't get done because he was either distracted or, running around in the classroom. And we've talked about that. We are trying to work with him on focusing strategies and things of that nature and developing a work ethic. But, I think that's a larger problem too, is that especially as the kids get a little bit older, I'm currently writing through some stuff where I'm trying to take on the system and how it's set up to fail our kids because we cram kids into classrooms where they have zero desire to want to be there, all because somebody has arbitrarily decided that, well, you have to sit through an Algebra 1 class, you have to sit through English 10, English 11, you have to take certain number of electives, so on and so forth. You have to take a foreign language. And so instead of allowing a kid who may be a phenomenal, I'm thinking of one kid in particular in my current school that I teach in that is a phenomenal visual arts student. I mean, the kid's he's got charisma, he's got talent, he's doing performances at local theater troupes and singing and modeling. And I thought, you know what, that's a kid that should be, out of the 6 hours that he's in our building, he should be spending 4 to 5 hours down with the visual arts program, learning how to produce, learning how to edit, learning how to perform, looking at all aspects of the business so that he can decide, hey, is this something that I want to do or not? What angle do I want to take here as I transition out of the building and into my adult career? But instead, we shove him into an algebra class. Whereas he shared with me, he said on one test, I placed at a certain level, but on another test that matters for my credit, I didn't pass. So now he has to take remedial math courses. And I'm just sitting there thinking, gosh, and we wonder why. Same thing with like our automotive program. We've got this huge, huge space in our building where we should have probably 10 to 15% of our population in that room learning how the automobile works, going through various different aspects of engineering and marketing and just all different phases of the automobile industry. That's their passion. That's their desire. Instead, we say, no, you got to take foreign language. You got to take a history class. You got to take this, that. And it's not to say that we couldn't offer those to kids, but why do we have this artificial system set in place? Again, I go back to the pressure that this puts on kids. And as we start to wrap up the episode today, I think something that you hit on there at the end is very important. This is an all-encompassing effort, ladies and gentlemen. I don't want to come across as pinpointing and placing all the blame on our school system. Certainly, there is a large portion of the blame to shoulder in that regard, but we as people have to step in as well. And I hear oftentimes teachers lament the lack of involvement from the parental side. Some of the home environments and the lack of caring that these kids go through is unimaginable when you hear stories of kids that have bounced through the DCS system or what have you. They're in foster care. We have to take care of our kids at home as well, or else it does us no good, no matter what system we have in place to educate the youth of our country, if we're not doing our jobs as parents as well. So I don't want to come across as totally bashing completely on one end. This is something that is going to take a team effort here. So I think that was an important thing. Now, as we conclude here today, Suzanne, I want to circle back one last time here to talk a little bit about what our next steps do you see as we move forward here? Clearly, we have to move on. We have to move forward. We can complain about, the president not having the authority to do this. We know he's going to do it. We can complain about the school, the way that it functions, but we know it's going to continue on. As parents, as educators, as members of the community, what is our role? What is our responsibility? What should we be doing as far as focusing on solutions here to this problem?
I think what we need is a total transformation of how we view the family unit, how we educate our children, and to simplify. So we cannot change what these politicians think about how we should educate our students. We cannot think how these politicians and social activists think that what kind of firearms we should be allowed to have. What we need to do is, we talk about secession a lot, and one of my strategies has been personal secession, from deciding to homeschool my children to being prepared and not wanting to rely on the government. Have faith in yourself and your children, and know that you can educate them yourself. If you are so inclined and feel the desire to do so, you can scale back. If you're in a big home, well, I have to make my house payments, my wife has to work. Do you really? Can you relocate? Think about changing your life. I absolutely changed my life. I moved from a house in California where I thought I'd be for the rest of my life, and I downsized. I have a a small house in the middle of nowhere in Utah where I could scale back and not have to worry about going to work and raise my children and spend time with them, take them around the country, let them see things. It's an adventure. And you know what? If you have to make the money, simplify for now and do it later. Your kids are going to be grown. Mine are 19 and 17 now. And, you know, it goes really fast. Take the time, educate your kids, let them be the drivers of their education. You mentioned auto shop. We'll have to do another show on this and homeschooling and passion-driven education. I did a show on that by a guy named Connor Boyack, who wrote a book for that. He wrote the book Tuttle Twins that Tom Woods talks about a lot and promotes, and Dr. Paul promotes. So that's where we can move forward, is think about something that you thought was undoable and go out and do it.
Oh, that's great. I love that. Yeah, I like that. I like Brian McClanahan has his show, and he talks oftentimes about think local, act local. And that's really kind of resonated with me as well. And so, yeah, I really like that as a solution to just kind of looking at what we can do personally in our communities, in our neighborhoods. I think that's a very, very powerful message there that we should take hold of and really kind of wrestle with that and let that set in and think about what is it that, you know, you can be doing to be the agent of change, to harbor change, you know, with what you have the ability to do within your personal life. You know, Mike says all the time in conversations that we have at school, you know, look, our kids get one shot. You know, we all do. We get one shot at life, and you know, for them to have to live it the way that I have seen up to this point, some of the effects of schooling on my fourth grader. He's 10 years old, and I just shudder to think about, you know, that there may be 7, 8 more years of this, and what that might mean for him as he continues to grow from a boy to a man. And so, no, absolutely. I think those are all very, very powerful statements there and things for our listeners to think about. Well, Suzanne, I'd like to thank you again for taking the time to come on this morning. We really appreciate always your perspective. You bring certainly a wealth of knowledge and a unique perspective that I hope the listeners can take to heart. And thank you for taking the time to join us this morning.
I really appreciated the opportunity, and I'm happy to continue this conversation anytime you like.
All right. Well, that's going to do it for our episode today. Again, thank you for hanging in here on the YouTube feed. We'll be back again next week with another episode. Mike and I are going to be on Wednesday talking about economics and inequality. We hope you can join us then. Until then, you have now heard The Other Side.
Thanks for listening. And remember, you're not fully informed until you've heard The Other Side.